video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order Ravnica Allegiance at cardkingdom.com right now. Hello everyone, I'm Nitzahone, and today we're continuing with my full set limited review, which we've been doing the last few days. We'll be doing for the next several days. So far we've looked at every white and blue card in Ravnica Allegiance, and I've given my thoughts about them, how good I think they'll be in this upcoming format. Today we're continuing with black, tomorrow we'll continue with red, and so on. Before we get started, I want to remind you that if you are new to these videos and you want to know what the grades I use in these videos mean, there's a short video in the description below that sort of goes over that for you. Alright, let's look at the first black card. First up, we have Awaken the Erstwhile, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery, and it says each player discards all the cards in their hand, then creates that many 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. What even is this? Even if this only worked for you discarding cards to get zombies, it would still not be very good. It would be a way to turn like 2 to 3 lands in your hand in the late game into creatures. Wouldn't be terrible, I guess. It would be like a D+. But letting your opponent do it too, I think that firmly pushes it to F. Sure, yeah, I'm sure you will occasionally get your opponent with it when they have 0 cards and you have like 5, but those situations won't come up very often, and even if that is the situation, it isn't exactly game-breaking. That's an F. Don't play it. Next up, we have Bankrupt in Blood, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice 2 creatures, draw 3 cards. So this card is going to be pretty bad in any deck that doesn't have access to Afterlife, so in a lot of ways this is really only around for the orJava deck. So if you can make lots of creature tokens and sacrifice them, or sacrifice creatures with Afterlife to this though, it's going to be nice. But that essentially makes this a build around. I think this is unplayable in a deck that doesn't have nice ways to pay the additional cost, which means it's an F. Even in an Afterlife deck, I would be hesitant to play this unless I was really getting there on the mechanic, which I do think is possible, but I'm going to say it's probably a C in that deck, because there's going to be times where you cut this even from that deck if you don't pick up enough synergy for sacrificing stuff. I do think it's worth noting the Racktoes deck probably also decent at sacrificing things, probably not as good as orJava, so it's gonna work there too, but it'll definitely be its best in orJava. Next up is Blade Juggler, which for 4 generic and a black is a 3/2 human rogue. It has Spectacle. That's the Racktoes mechanic. It's the first time we're seeing it in this video, so I'll remind you that what it means is you can pay an alternate cost if your opponent has lost life this turn, and remember, doing damage to your opponent is them losing life. And in this case, Spectacle is 2 generic and a black. The creature's a 3/2, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to you, and you draw a card. This is a really strong common. I would pay 5 mana for a 3/2 that draws me a card already. I mean, it wouldn't be great, it'd be like a C. But the fact that that's the fail case here is a good indication of how good this card is. If you can play this on turn 3 or 4 with Spectacle, then you'll really be getting there. 2-for-1s go a long way towards winning, and that's what this will be most of the time. As far as commons go, this is probably the best black one that isn't removal anyway. I honestly think you can first pick this without feeling too bad about it. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Blade Brand, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon instant. It says target creature gains Death Touch until end of turn, draw a card. Combat tricks that just give Death Touch are usually pretty bad. This is because you aren't pumping your creature, you're just making it so it trades with another, which 2-for-1s yourself. Adding the draw a card to this is nice, as it mitigates against that 2-for-1 and makes it a 1-for-1, but you're still giving up a creature. It still isn't great, but it's not quite an F. Instead, I think it's a D, something you'll only play if you're short on playables. It still has the problem that you're not going to make your creature survive from it. Next up, we have Blood Mist Infiltrator, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/1 vampire at uncommon. When it attacks, you may sacrifice another creature, and if you do, Blood Mist Infiltrator can't be blocked this turn. This would be kind of bad in a vacuum. 3 mana 3/1s are obviously not really getting there on the stats you want, and sacrificing a creature to it's a relevant cost. However, in a format with Afterlife, where sacrificing creatures has less of a downside, it does get better. It's still asking you for some serious synergy, and the payoff you get for sacrificing isn't exactly incredible. It's just an unblockable 3/1, which, yeah, can be some nice late game reach. I think it's just a C though. It isn't the big sacrifice payoff you're looking for, but it's an okay one. Next up, we have Carrion Imp, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/3 imp at common, has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you may exile target creature card from a graveyard. If you do, you gain 2 life. So the exiling something from a graveyard thing won't really be relevant most of the time in this format. However, it's still a 4 mana 2/3 that gains you 2 when it comes into play, and that's alright. Problem is, it does need a graveyard creature to gain you some life, and that won't always happen. I think this is a card that makes the cut more often than it doesn't, but isn't exactly a card you're looking for, and it's going to get cut a significant portion of the time too. All that means it's a C-. Next up, we have Catacomb Crocodile, which has awesome flavor text, but also it's 4 generic and a black for a 3/7 Crocodile at common. So this is vanilla, but it has stats that are nice to bring to the table for 3 mana. I mean, a 3/7 can really lock down the ground and keep your opponent from being interested in attacking you. That said, it isn't something that's exciting. I'm just saying it isn't terrible as vanilla cards go, and it's probably a D+. You play it if you really need some big guy to lock down the ground and you didn't pick up a better one. And, you know, that's sort of the classic definition of a D+, that you don't normally want to play it, but you will if you have to. Next up, we have Clear the Stage, which for 4 generic and a black is an uncommon instant, and it says, target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. If you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you may return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So a 5 mana -3/-3 removal spell would probably be something like a C. Adding the extra stuff to this is nice, though. 4 power creatures aren't impossible to get into play, so if you can turn this into a 2-for-1 by getting a creature back, you're going to have an excellent time with this. Still, I don't think it gets above C+, because you will probably just be doing the -3/-3 part of the card about half the time. It's like a B when you manage to pull that off, and I'm sort of giving you the average between the two versions of the card, where it's just sort of a overcosted removal spell, or a card that gives you a 2-for-1. And that's a pretty significant difference, but I think that means it's a C+. I guess I could kind of see, you know, as I'm sort of talking about this card, I could kind of see first picking it in a weak pack, and maybe that means I should push it up into a B-, but it's just going to have such a wild variation on how good it is that it's hard for me to want to do that. Next up, we have Consigned to the Pit, which for 5 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says, destroy target creature. Consigned to the Pit deals 2 damage to that creature's controller. So far, the removal in this format has really been lacking, at least in the monocolored area. When we get to gold, we're going to see some better removal. But this continues the trend of these monocolored removal spells that aren't as exciting as you kind of expect to see 1 or 2 really good removal spells. 6 mana to kill something is a little too much to be premium. Most of the time, you're going to be behind on mana because you're paying 6 mana to kill a 4-drop or whatever. Adding 2 damage to the effect is not worth the additional mana. A 5 mana kill spell would just be way better. I think this tops out at C+. I will say, if the removal in this set ends up being as mediocre on average as it seems so far, these cards may move up some because you're so desperate for any removal at all. Next up, we have Cry of the Carnarium, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says, all creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn, exile all creature cards in all graveyards that were put there from the battlefield this turn. If a creature would die this turn, exile it instead. So this is the kind of effect that people will be wanting in more controlling decks to stymie those more aggressive strategies that will be out there. The fact that it exiles this stuff it kills does matter too in a world of Afterlife. Still, usually when we see this effect, it is only good in a very narrow number of decks. You don't want to be playing this if you're the beatdown, and both Racktoes and orJava seem like they can go that route. As a result, I think it can be really great in the right deck, but that deck won't come together often enough to warrant taking this early, and for that reason I think it's a C+. It'll be a really key card in your deck if you're a slow control deck, for sure, but if you're not, you probably just don't play it. Next up we have Dead Revels, which for 3 generic and a black is a common sorcery. It has Spectacle for 1 generic and a black, and you return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. Without Spectacle, this is probably still relatively playable at like C-. Getting 2 creatures back for 4 isn't a bad effect, and it does get better the more bombs and stuff you have. It is obviously kind of useless early, and it's frustrating to get this in like your opening hand, but the less this costs, the more frequently you'll be able to cast one of the things you get back, so that's nice. That's what you'll probably get to do if you get Spectacle going. Basically, every format is one of these nice late-game graveyard, 2-for-1 cards for black, and you basically always want to play one of them in your black decks, but usually not more than that. I'm giving it a C. Next up we have Debtors Transport, which for 5 generic and a black is a 5/3 Thrall at common, and it has Afterlife 2. First time we're seeing this mechanic. It means when it dies, it puts into play X number of white and black spirit tokens, where X is, the Afterlife number, which in this case is 2. The tokens also have flying. So this is a solid common. 6 mana is kind of a lot, but this can trade with a lot of creatures thanks to that high power, and then leave behind 2 1/1 flyers, and I'm down for that. I see myself playing one of these in most of my black decks, but because it is so costly, you probably don't want more than that. I don't see myself cutting the first copy of this very often, though. I'm giving it a C. Next up we have Drill Bit, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It has Spectacle for a single black mana, and it says target player reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, that player discards that card. I don't like discard spells in most limited formats. For them to be worth it, they need to do a little something extra, like Surveil or Scry. or something like that, making an opponent discard a card. Even one of your choice is not worth 3 mana a lot of the time. This can be a super efficient discard spell at 1 black, but 2 black is super steep. I mean, whoever played Never Happened in the main board in the last set? If you did, you probably shouldn't have. I don't know, because this can be 1 black some of the time, I do think you can play it as like a subpar 23rd card or whatever, but I think you mostly want to bring this out of the sideboard against decks that have cards even in the mid to late game, so decks that are slower, grindier, this is going to be better against. And those decks with high curves and scary bombs will make this worth siding in, but I'm going to give it a D as a main board card and a C as a sideboard card. Next up, we have Font of Agonies, which for 1 black mana is a rare enchantment. Whenever you pay life, put that many blood counters on Font of Agonies, and you can pay 1 generic and a black to remove the 4 blood counters to destroy target creature. This is a weird card to have here. There just aren't enough things in this format that you pay life for, so this is utterly unplayable in limited. I do think the design is really cool. I think it's another one of those cards that was sort of designed more with EDH in mind, and a lot of those cards end up not being very good in limited, and this one is just stone unplayable. It's an F. Next up, we have Grotesque Demise, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says exile target creature with power 3 or less. So outside of red, as we've noted, there is not very much cheap instant speed removal in this format. I think in a lot of formats this might be something like a C+, but in this one, where you're desperate for cheap removal for the early part of the game, I think this is probably going to overperform given the context. It even deals with creatures with annoying afterlife, and I think this is actually first pickable, which means it's a B-. Next up, we have Gutterboned, which for 1 black mana is a 2/1 skeleton warrior at rare. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you can pay 1 generic and a black to return it from your graveyard to your hand, but it has sort of a spectacle. Activate this ability only during your turn, and only if an opponent lost life this turn. So this is the kind of card that will be way better in constructed. 1 mana 2/1s don't scale super well in limited, where you can't really guarantee you have a deck filled with cheap efficient creatures, which is where this will shine. But the fact that it can block does make it better than some of these, hard to kill creatures, and the fact that it can attack without abandon in a lot of situations is nice. I mean, if you are attacking with something you know will get through because of flying or whatever, then you might as well attack with Gutterbones, since you can just bring it back if they kill it, so it's fine. It does get a little better in decks that have sacrifice outlets, where you can sort of consistently sacrifice him, get it back and all of that, and he can, basically be a nice sacrifice fodder. But he's nothing special. I think it may have more of a future in an aggressive deck in Standard than it does in Limited, but I guess it's about a C+ in this format. Next up, we have Ill-Gotten Inheritance, which for 3 generic and a black is a common enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, Ill-Gotten Inheritance deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you gain 1 life. Then it has an activated ability where you can pay 5 generic and a black and sacrifice it, and it deals 4 damage to target opponent, and you gain 4 life. So if you're really desperate for a grindy win condition and your deck is loaded with removal and defensive creatures, I guess this does the job, but it's way too slow and does not immediately impact the board. It really never impacts the board. It just changes life totals a little bit, and it's not worth it in most decks. I do think it's possible that this is like a legitimate win condition in some kind of really grindy control deck, and for that reason, I don't quite want to give it an F, but I'm getting as close as I can with a D-. Next up, we have Noxious Groody, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 beast at common, and it has Death Touch. 3 mana 2/2s with Death Touch can trade for anything, and that's nice. I always feel like 3 mana Death Touchers are actually worse than 1 mana ones, mostly because you're not going to get the huge mana advantage you get with 1 mana Death Touchers, but they're still fine, serviceable cards, and actually they can attack a little better. Sometimes if you have good defensive stuff going on and your opponent's only creatures are things they don't want to be blocking with, a Death Toucher with, you can get in for a couple damage with these, which is a little less likely with the 1 mana guys. So this is a fine, serviceable card. It's a solid 3-drop for any black deck, and it's a C. Next up, we have orJava Enforcer, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/2 human rogue at uncommon with Death Touch and Afterlife 1. This seems really good to me. I'm always happy with Death Touch creatures that, we've already talked about that can trade for anything. Add a 1/1 spirit token to that trade, and I'm way happier with the deal. This seems like it's going to grind opponents to a screeching halt on the ground. That's not something every deck will be into, but hey, it can attack even if you need it to. I think this is something you actively feel good about having in your deck because it goes with the orJava game plan so well. That is, swarm the board with flyers and lock down the ground. This can either help you get a flyer or lock down the ground. I think in some weak packs you can first pick this, and you should feel pretty good about taking it relatively early. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have orJava Racketeers, which for 4 generic and a black is a 3/2 human rogue at uncommon, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card, and it has Afterlife 2. A 5-mana 3/2 with his ability is not something that would normally be all that good, mostly because you'll basically never hit your opponent with it since it is so easy to trade down with. Adding Afterlife to this makes it interesting though. Your opponent has to choose whether or not they want to deal with annoying tokens or take the 3 damage and discard a card. There will be times where that choice is very difficult, and it's always good to make your opponent's life difficult. This can do defense alright too, trading with any X3 and leaving behind your spirit tokens. I think this is the kind of card you probably want one of in any black deck, but not the kind of card I want to take with the first pick ever, although I did struggle a little bit with my grade on this, sort of going back and forth between C+ and B-. I think there's a little bit of a chance that it's better than a C+ and may even be first pickable, but in the end, I think it's a C+ just because it has such mediocre stats. Next up, we have Pestilence Spirit, which for 2 generic and a black is a rare spirit. It's a 3/2, it's got Menace and Death Touch, that's another Death Toucher. And instant and sorcery spells you control have Death Touch. This is pretty nasty. It's basically an upgraded Boggart Brute, that is to say a 3-mana 3/2 with Menace, a card that's like a C+ in most limited formats. Nice little 3-drops with evasion, usually are C+, but this just gets nasty with everything else it comes with. Adding Death Touch to a Menace creature is always scary because it means that no matter what, you're going to take down 2 creatures that block this. Making any of your spells that do damage into kill spells is no joke either, though if I had to guess, I think in most cases that comes up like once a draft, though that's plenty. You can build around it to some degree too, but I wouldn't recommend going crazy on picking up spells like that because it is fairly fragile, and if it dies, your like subpar damage spells might not really be worth it. But it's also not bad on defense since it can of course trade with anything. So it is a 3-drop that's good at all stages of the game, and as a result, I think it's worth taking with the first pick in mini packs. I think it's a solid B. Next up, we have Plague White, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 zombie at common. And it says whenever Plague White becomes blocked, each creature blocking it gets -1/-1 until end of turn. This is a fine 2-drop. It does mean that it can't be blocked by X1s, and it can down X2s if they block. I wish it was more like Onerous Goblin, though, who can take down X3s even when blocking. I think this is probably something that barely makes the cut in most cases. When you really want that 2-drop and you don't have any other good ones, I think it's a C-. Next up, we have Priest of Forgotten Gods, which for 1 generic and a black is a human cleric at rare. You can tap it and sacrifice 2 other creatures, and any number of target players each lose 2 life and sacrifice a creature, and you add 2 black and draw a freaking card. This card is one of the ones I'm the most excited to play with. It is interesting. The dream here is to pair it with white and get lots of afterlife going so you aren't sacrificing much. The truth is, though, that sometimes sacrificing 2 creatures for this powerful of an effect will be worth it anyway a lot of the time. If you have a lot of extra creatures and your problem is that you need to dig through your deck for a spell you desperately need, she can do the job while also thinning out your opponent's board. Keep in mind, she can also do this at instant speed, which really complicates life for your opponent. You can do it in response to removal, although keep in mind she can't sacrifice herself, so if they target her with removal, you have to tap her, sacrifice 2 other creatures, and then she'll die to the removal spell. But a lot of the times I think that'll be worth it. You can also block with creatures and then use this ability. There are a lot of annoying options here for your opponent. I mean, I think she's a build-around, but she's not the kind with an absurdly low floor. I think she's probably a C+, even a deck with 0 afterlife. And if you can really abuse her, she probably pushes straight into the A range, as she will just win you the game. Because of the reasonable floor and high ceiling, I know I'm going to be tempted to first pick her, probably more than tempted. I'm going to first pick her, and you should be too. Next up, we have Racktoes Trumpeter, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/3 human shaman at common. It's got Menace, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 3 generic and a red, and it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. As we've been seeing, there's a whole cycle of these commons that have 1 color and then have an activated ability in another color of whatever guild they're in. 2-mana 1/3s are always alright. Adding Menace to it probably makes it maybe a D+. Then adding the activated ability, it probably gets better. The nice thing about this member of this cycle is that in a pinch, playing this in your non-Racktoes deck is probably kind of okay. I think it's a C- though, and nothing special. Next up, we have Spawn of Mayhem, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a mythic rare demon. It has Spectacle for 1 generic and 2 black. It's got Flying, it's got Trample, it's a 4/4, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, Spawn of Mayhem deals 1 damage to each player. Then, if you have 10 or less life, put a +1/+1 counter on Spawn of Mayhem. So a 4 mana 4/4 with flying and trample is great, but you know what's better? Also having the potential to be a 3 mana 4/4 flying trample. It doesn't really seem insane to make that happen. Lots of people will just take a hit if you play a 2-drop, and if you follow that up with this on turn 3, the game's basically over. Also, by the way, in most formats, having both flying and trample seems kind of silly, since so few things can block a flyer as is, but I think in this format where spirit tokens will be around, trample and flying together does make a difference. Anyway, this guy represents an even quicker clock than his 4/4 body represents because he also does 1 damage to both players at the beginning of your upkeep. And if you're at low enough life, he starts to get bigger. He can also help you set up future cards with the spectacle mechanic from the damage he does. There's going to be like a rare corner case where you don't get to control the 1 damage and that ends up costing you. But most of the time, this guy's just going to kill your opponent before they know what's going on. This is an easy first pick and an A-. Next up, we have Spire Mangler, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/1 insect at uncommon. It's got flash and flying, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature with flying you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. A 3 mana 2/1 with flying and flash is on its own probably at least a C, maybe a C+. Those stats, even without flash, are sort of reasonable, and giving you the ability to flash it into surprise block a flyer isn't too bad either. This is considerably better than that, though, because it can pump the power of flyers at instant speed. Now, keep in mind this includes itself if you don't have any other flyers, so you can flash this in to trade with anything that has 4 or less toughness, which is a solid deal, or you can play it on your own turn to make a spirit token or whatever hit a little harder. Both of these options seem pretty good to me. I think in some weaker packs this is worth first picking. It's a B-, and I think you take it relatively highly. Next up, we have Thirsting Shade, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 shade at common. It's got lifelink, and like all shades, it can make itself bigger. In this case, you pay 2 generic and a black, and it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Adding lifelink to one of these shades is kind of interesting. Lifelink is a powerful keyword ability because it makes racing go so far in your favor. However, casting 3 to pump this particular shade is a little steep. If it were 2 mana, we'd be getting somewhere, but 3? I think that's just asking too much. Investing 6 into this just so it can be a 3/3 does not sound great to me. I think that this is worth playing only if things went really bad in your draft and you need some like late game win condition and you have tons of mana and you can stall the game and this is the best you can do. But I hope that doesn't happen to you because I think it's a D. Next up, we have Undercity Scavenger, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 ogre warrior at common. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Undercity Scavenger, then scry 2. This seems like a nice common to me, especially if you have afterlife creatures. 4 mana for a 3/3 is obviously not good, but as a fail case, it could be worse. If you have a creature who is no longer relevant because of the board state or a creature with afterlife, you're getting a pretty great deal here. 4 for a 5/5 and scry 2 is some serious business. It may just be worth sacrificing any creature for that effect. You have a huge creature for mana cost and get to improve your next few draws. I think this is a pretty nice common for black decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Undercity's Embrace, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant. It says target opponent sacrifices a creature. If you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you gain 4 life. Edict effects are not usually that great in limited, especially at 3 or more mana. They're alright, but you have to have the right board state, or at least your opponent does, or the impact can be really small since your opponent gets to choose what to sacrifice. In this format, too, we've already seen 2 decks that kind of like sacrificing things. We've seen hints of them, both Racktoes and orJava, so against them, this is going to be especially obnoxious. For you, as in not good. I think this is the kind of removal spell that you play when you don't get the better ones, and it is still removal, but it's so situational and can be so mediocre that I don't think it's anything more than a C. The gaining 4 life doesn't really make a difference. Next up, we have Vindictive Vampire, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/3 uncommon vampire, and whenever another creature you control dies, it deals 1 damage to each opponent and you gain 1 life. So here is our aristocrat enabler in the set. You knew there had to be one. This seems like it could get especially out of hand with sacrifice outlets, some of which we've talked about in this video. You're already getting nice value for sacrificing stuff, so also draining your opponent 1 life is pretty nice. This is a build around. I don't like it very much on its own. It has such mediocre stats for the cost. I think you need to have a deck with lots of sacrifice and or afterlife going on before this is worth it, which means it's like a D+ in like a typical black deck, but it does have a ceiling of a C+ and maybe even a B-. Well, that was the last black card in Ravnica Allegiance. Tomorrow I'll be back to talk about every red card in the set. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of my Ravnica Allegiance content, of which there'll be a lot of, including draft videos in the not too distant future, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.